and answers part 1. What is ASP.NET? ASP.NET is a server-side scripting technology that enables scripts embedded in web pages to be executed by an internet server. ASP.NET provides increased performance by running compiled code. What is difference between namespace and assembly? Namespace is a logical design time naming convenience, whereas an assembly establishes the name scope for types at runtime. What is the difference between classic ASP and ASP.NET? ASP is interpreted language based on scripting languages like JavaScript or VB Script. ASP has mixed HTML and coding language, limited development and debugging tools available, limited OOP support, limited session and application state management. ASP.NET is supported by compiler and has compiled language support. Separate code and design logic possible, variety of compilers and tools available including the Visual Studio.NET. Completely object oriented, complete session and application state management, full XML support for easy data exchange. What is difference between namespace and assembly? Namespace is a logical design time naming convenience, whereas an assembly establishes the name scope for types at runtime. What is the difference between early binding and late binding? Calling a non-virtual method decided at a compile time is known as early binding. Calling a virtual method, pure polymorphism, decided at a runtime is known as late binding. What is the difference between ASP session state and ASP.NET session state? ASP session state relies on cookies, serialize all requests from a client, does not survive process shutdown, cannot maintained across machines in a web form. What is the difference between ASP session and ASP.NET session? ASP.NET session supports cookie-less session and it can span across multiple servers. What is reflection? All .NET compilers produce metadata about the types defined in the modules they produce. This metadata is packaged along with the module. Modules in turn are packaged together in assemblies and can be accessed by a mechanism called reflection. The system.reflection namespace contains classes that can be used to interrogate the types for a module or assembly. What is a postback? The process in which a web page sends data back to the same page on the server. What is the difference between server.transfer and response.redirect? The server.transfer method stops the current page from executing and runs the content on the specified page. When the execution is complete, the control is passed back to the calling page, while the response.redirect method transfers the control on the specified page and the control is never passed back to calling page after execution. What is namespace? Does the web page belong in the .NET Framework class hierarchy? System.web.ui.page. What's a bubbled event? When you have a complex control like data grid, writing an event processing routine for each object, cell, button, row, etc. is quite tedious. The controls can bubble up their event handlers along the main data grid event handler to take care of its constituents. What is the difference between server-side and client-side code? Server-side code executes on the server. Client-side code executes in the client's browser. What is the difference between static or dynamic assemblies? Assemblies can be static or dynamic. Static assemblies can include .NET framework types, interfaces and classes, as well as resources for the assembly, bitmaps, JPEG files, resource files, and so on. Static assemblies are stored on disk in portable executable files. Dynamic assemblies, which are run directly from memory and are not saved to disk before execution. You can save dynamic assemblies to disk after they have executed. What are the difference between structure and class? Structures are value type and classes are reference type. Structures cannot have constructor or destructors. Classes can have both constructor and destructors. Structures do not support inheritance, while classes support inheritance. What is the differences between dataset.clone and dataset.copy? Dataset.clone copies just the structure of dataset, including all the data tables, schemas, relations, and constraints. However, it does not copy the data. Dataset.copy copies both the dataset structure and the data. What is the difference between custom control and user control? Custom controls are compiled code, easier to use, difficult to create, and can be placed in toolbox. Drag and drop controls attributes can be set visually at design time. Can be used by multiple applications if shared EIS. Even if private, can copy to bin directory of web application, add reference and use. Normally designed to provide common functionality independent of consuming application. User controls are similar to those of ASP, include files, easy to create, cannot be placed in the toolbox and dragged dropped from it. A user control is shared among the single application files. What is the difference between ASP session state and ASP.NET session state? ASP session state relies on cookies, serialize all requests from a client, does not survive process shutdown, cannot maintained across machines in a web form. What is view state? View state is a .NET mechanism to store the posted data among postbacks. View state allows the state of objects to be stored in a hidden field on the page, saved on client side, and transported back to server whenever required. What is authentication and authorization? Authentication is the process of identifying users. Authentication is identifying or validating the user against the credentials, username and password, and authorization performs after authentication. Authorization is the process of granting access to those users based on identity. Authorization allowing access of specific resource to user.